Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, Canada is giving its official response to the global tariffs announced by Donald Trump yesterday afternoon, noting while Canada was not specifically targeted, our auto, steel, aluminum, potash, and energy industries are still subjected to American tariffs. A clear signal to the Prime Minister that Canada's once close relationship with the United States is now a thing of the past.
Yesterday's actions by the U.S. administration, while not specifically targeting Canada, will rupture the global economy and adversely affect global economic growth. Our old relationship of steadily deepening integration with the United States is over. The 80-year period when the United States embraced the mantle of global economic leadership, when it forged alliances rooted in trust and mutual respect, and championed the free and open exchange of goods and services, is over.
Now, in that same news conference, Mark Carney, in his capacity as Prime Minister, announced that Ottawa will impose a 25% tariff on U.S.-made vehicles, but the tariff will not apply to vehicles that are CUSMA compliant, nor will they apply to vehicles made in Mexico, nor on auto parts. And the government is also promising to provide federal relief to automakers that continue to invest and produce goods in Canada. So a plan to hit back, but the pain of Trump's tariffs are already being felt in Windsor, Ontario, where today Stellantis announced that its assembly plant in that city will shut down for 2 weeks starting April the 7th. That puts more than 3,000 people out of work, with more schedule changes expected in the weeks to come. And as for the automaker, it did issue a statement. It reads in part as follows: Stellantis continues to assess the effects of the recently announced U.S. tariffs on imported vehicles and will continue to engage with the U.S. administration on these policy changes. Immediate actions we must take include temporarily pausing production at some of our Canadian and Mexican assembly plants, which will have an impact to several of our U.S. powertrain and stamping facilities that support those operations. Well, for some reaction to all this, we're now reaching out to the Mayor of Windsor, Drew Dilkens. Mayor Dilkens, thank you for joining us this evening again.
Thanks very much, Michael.
So, immediately after Trump makes this announcement, Stellantis on its own announces this temporary shutdown. They also talk about possible shift changes in future. So let's start there. I'm wondering if you've heard about any other future disruptions that may be coming down the pipes for your city.
No, this was the first and the biggest, and happened right away, as you can tell. Stellantis is our largest employer. The Windsor Assembly Plant makes the Chrysler Pacifica and the Grand Caravan, which of course is sold all throughout North America and around the world. And so to see Stellantis launch a shutdown for 2 weeks, and to hear that it's happening in Mexico and it will also affect U.S. plants, I think this is just the start of many unfortunate things to come as a result of Donald Trump's announcement yesterday.
Okay, just the start. Are you fearful then that we might be looking at the assembly moving south of the border? Because ultimately that is what Donald Trump wants to see happen.
Yeah, I'm not there yet, but of course that's always in the back of our mind. Any mayor would have that in the back of their mind, absolutely, especially because it is our largest employer in the community. But I also know that there are two fallacies that Donald Trump's narrative is based on, and that is that there are hundreds of billions of dollars of available capital just waiting to be invested in the United States, and that is not the case. And the other fallacy is that there are just all sorts of workers waiting to take all of these jobs that purportedly are moving to the United States. And we know that the U.S. has about 4% unemployment today by any economic standard that is considered full employment in an economy. And if you look in my community, where we have one of the largest tool, die, and mold clusters in all of North America, that is an expertise that has been built up over the better part of 100 years. These folks are not just moving to the United States tomorrow. And so there are two fallacies that underpin the president's argument, but based on what he's done, trying to reorder global trade and the announcement with tariffs that he made yesterday, certainly there's an impact in the markets, there's an impact in my community today, and I would expect that you'll see these ripples continue to take effect, including at plants in the United States.
Mm-hmm. I think sometimes we get caught up in the numbers, because ultimately when we talk about Stellantis temporarily pausing production, what we're talking about are thousands of people being laid off temporarily. And if there are future changes, perhaps even longer than expected, what type of pain will this cause for Windsor and the people who live in your community?
Well, two weeks is not going to be catastrophic for the community, but it's what happens after that, and recognizing that the tariffs that the president put in place, there are some exemptions for vehicles that where the parts are made in the United States, but that really requires, if you think about the mechanics here, it really requires every automaker to dissect all of the parts in every vehicle that they make that crosses the border 6 to 8 times before it's placed in a vehicle for final assembly, and figure out which of those parts is made in the United States, is going to another country for continuous improvement. And how many parts would that be? Well, the average vehicle, 30 to 40,000 different parts. And of course, a lot of these parts are made in the US and Canada and Mexico, but you have chips and circuit boards coming over from Taiwan and from China. You have cable harnessing, wire harnessing coming from different countries. Siemens is making things in Germany, sending them over. And so it is a very complex system that has been built here. And the unfortunate part of all of this, Michael, is that we have built this together. This is not Canada, contrary to the president's remarks, Canada stealing the auto industry from the United States. We have built this together since the 1960s. And so it's unfortunate to see the impact that will be that is taking effect as of today in Windsor, but will certainly cascade throughout the auto industry and the parts sector in the weeks to come.
Yeah. I wonder as well, because we're talking about, at the very least, the status quo, perhaps that restoring after 2 weeks' time. But, as a civic leader, I'm sure you're always looking beyond the status quo, trying to grow your community, trying to grow the prosperity in your community. But given this uncertainty right now, what does it mean for future investment in Windsor and the hopes of your city to grow and provide more for the people there?
Well, it's concerning. Of course, it's the type of thing that keeps me awake at night. But let me just tell you, today, we just had an announcement with a company called Mint, which is a global auto parts supplier. They're investing $300 million to open their 78th factory that they have in the world here in Windsor. They're going to employ 1,100 people. Despite the announcement yesterday, they continued to come here and say, we still think this is a good investment to make at this location at this time. And so that's really positive news. But our largest employer, Stellantis, is critical for the community's success. And we have done everything for more than 100 years to support that operation in the city of Windsor. They're here because the men and women who work there make quality vehicles. There's a reason they're in Canada. And so are we concerned that, at some point in the future, this could move somewhere else? Well, of course we are. And that's why I'm happy to see our government moving forward with some retaliatory tariffs. And I think that's the first thing to come. You are going to see all sorts of countries, including the European Union and other countries, move to band together to figure out how to defeat, in a quick order, I hope, to defeat the tariffs that are being put in place by the United States, to send the pain signals through the economy back to the U.S., to get the president to reconsider a position that we know is not in the best interest of his own residents.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned being happy with the counter tariffs that Ottawa is pushing through. We're also hearing from various political leaders. For example, Pierre Poilievre today talks about removing the GST on Canadian-built vehicles as a way of helping the auto industry. We heard Mark Carney today making the promise of investing $2 billion in terms of perhaps retooling the Canadian auto industry to make a far more Canadian infrastructure around building a Canadian product. What's your reaction to those proposals? Do either of those strike you as something that is worthwhile pursuing right now?
Well, I think Pierre Poilievre's comment certainly is bright, because right away that can be implemented and would have an immediate impact to give a boost to the Canadian auto sector. So that's something that could be done short term. Let's see it happen and implement it right away. Longer term, what the Prime Minister is talking about, rebuilding and sort of repatriating supply chains in the auto parts sector back to Canada. Interesting concept. It's going to take a lot longer to do that. Also predicated on the fact that there has to be hundreds of millions and hundreds of billions of dollars available to move factories to Canada. So certainly a long-term plan. But you know what? Both of those things working in concert with each other, and anything one can do today to help us get through this difficult period that we're going to be going through collectively, not just as a city, but our country. Frankly, there's going to be pain in our continent, and you're going to see pain around the world. And the fear, I think, for everyone is that this is going to lead to some form of global recession that, ultimately is not good for anyone. We're in a very difficult spot if that happens.
Mayor, quickly running out of time, but I'm wondering what your outreach has been to Stellantis, whether or not you've been able to perhaps get some type of comforting word about the future ahead from that company.
Yeah, you'll never get that from Stellantis or Ford or GM. These guys are operating in a very globally competitive environment. And so to see a pause here, thinking and going back to the 30,000 part and component comment, Michael, it's right for them now to take a pause and figure out whether they can make money making vehicles and what they have to charge for these vehicles. And I think in very short order, you're going to see the price of the vehicles rise between $4,000 and up to $12,000 as the companies have to readjust the price of the vehicle to now take into effect the tariffs that are being applied from all sorts of different countries that apply to all the different components that are feeding into the manufacture of that vehicle. And so they're all going to be doing, all the OEMs are going to be doing this calculation and figuring out what the future looks like for them. Unfortunately, there's disruption, and it disrupts families and communities like mine while all of that work happens.
Okay. Well, of course, we'll speak again in the future, but Drew Dilkens, always appreciate the time. Thank you for that.
My pleasure.